We're beginning a new book today, The Ultimate Evil, an investigation of America's most dangerous satanic cult, with new evidence linking Charlie Manson and the Son of Sam by Maury Taylor. Now, if you go to purchase this book on Amazon, they want $1,600 for it, and if you want the cheap paperback version, they want $200 for it. But I'm fortunate enough to have a little bit of money to buy the original one on eBay for $250. Some people still might think that's an exorbitant price to pay for a book that once went for $17.95. This is how Amazon says, please don't pursue this information. Chapter 1. Oh, no, wait. Part 1. On Terror's Trial. Chapter 1. Satan at Stanford. At 11 p.m. on October 12, 1974, the lush, sprawling campus of Stanford University was alive with the sounds of Saturday night. From scattered pockets of partying, exuberant bursts of harmony, laughter, and the thump, thump, thump of reverberant bass guitars drifted from dormitory windows and doorways as the student population unwound from a week's worth of classes, study, and football fever. The love affair with big-time sports was enjoying a resurgence at the university, long known primarily as a bastion of academic excellence. But Jim Plunkett's Stanford Indians had ridden a dark horse out of nowhere to upset the world in the Rose Bowl game in the New Year's Day of '71. 4 seasons later, the pride still burned with the memory, and the fervor lingered on autumn Saturdays. And although it was mid-October, Columbus Day, a time of smoldering dry leaves and ripening pumpkins in the northern reaches of the country, it was a clear, pleasant evening in Palo Alto. A light breeze gently rattled the gum trees and palms that studded the campus and bore the musical merriment from one distant corner of the sparkling complex to the other. There were many such nights in the friendly climate of California's Silicon Valley, which nestled some 40 miles to the south and east of San Francisco. The valley's nickname, and the whole Santa Clara County, which enveloped it, spoke of tomorrow, progress, and affluence. The general vicinity of Palo Alto, including nearby San Jose, was home to a considerable number of high-technology corporations such as IBM, which had erected laboratories or development centers for the manufacture of advanced computer circuitry. Silicon is a non-metallic element critical to the production of semiconductors, hence the Silicon Valley label. And since Stanford graduates were harvested annually by the area's corporate residents, the school functioned as an integral part of the community that was science and academia oriented, a domicile of the prosperous and an enclave of both the scholar and the pragmatic business executive. Although Stanford and other local institutions were regarded as hallmarks of philosophical liberalism, the valley itself was considered a refuge of conservative mores and politics, especially when compared with its raucous northerly neighbor, San Francisco, or to that hissing viper vat located a more reassuring 350 miles to the south, Los Angeles. To Valley citizens, nearby Frisco was the site of the 1967's Summer of Love, and the haven of homosexuals, flower children, unwashed hippies, freaked-out bikers, and Jefferson Airplane, acid-drooling rock. It was a breeding ground of occult deviance and Satanism, and the harbor of the notorious North Beach section where Carol Doda and friends would shake their bodies and other such things nightly on the sweaty stages of Big Al's and the Condor Club. Excuse me. Just got to read it out. But to 19-year-old Bruce Perry, studying this October night away in a campus apartment At Stanford, those activities were as foreign as the Latin he'd soon have to master as a diligent second-year pre-med student. My goodness. Around him, out of doors, the sound of Saturday were faint in the wind, and only remotely tempting. God damn. Jesus. Bruce Perry was dedicated to his work, and a weekend with Hippocrates was as normal to him as was an evening with Led Zeppelin to some of his less industrious counterparts across the campus. Not that Bruce was always serious. He did have his moments, but for the immediate future, they seemed as long ago and far away as his hometown of Bismarck, North Dakota. By all accounts, Bruce Perry was an all-American boy from an all-American town whose family nurtured him with a Norman Rockwell Americana upbringing. The son of a comfortably set dentist, Dr. Duncan Perry, the handsome, curly-haired Bruce was a standout in both classroom and sports in Bismarck. His days at Bismarck High School had been alive and full. When he graduated in 1973, he was honored holder of a smattering of track and field records in North Dakota, including the state mark of the quarter mile. He was popular, deeply religious, and participated in fellowship of Christian athletes, both in school and at summer camps. In short, Bruce was a sure-shot pick to succeed in the world, and even more than that, since August 17, 1974, Bruce was a married man. His young, blonde bride, also 19, also from Bismarck, and also immersed in religious causes, was his high school sweetheart, the former airless Dykema. As Bruce labored over his assignments that October night, Arliss busied herself around the small but cozy corner apartment the couple shared on the second floor of the university Quelan Hall, a residence for married students. As it neared 11:30, Arliss gathered up some letters to Bismarck's family and friends, and told Bruce she was going out to mail them. Bruce shrugged at his bride, then decided to pack up his work and get outside for a while himself. He realized Arliss was showing signs of restlessness, and that he hadn't done very much to liven up her evening. Bruce was still adapting to the idea of being married. Marriage was adjustment, his parents advised, and was subject to growing pains. Not that he didn't love Arliss, he was happy she was with him, and she shared long hours of contentment and caring. In many respects, they complemented each other, but Bruce regretted that he'd seen so little of his fiancée the previous year. He had been alone at Stanford while Arliss remained in Bismarck, working with her religious friends, attending Bismarck Junior College, and squirreling money away for their wedding. During their months apart, the couple maintained regular contact, but it wasn't the same as being together. People can grow in any number of ways in the year after high school. Bruce took the concept of traditional marriage to heart. His religious background wouldn't have permitted otherwise. Arliss was his confidant, felt the same as he did. Life would be good, Bruce believed, with children and a comfortable home. But first they had to survive Stanford and cope with the added demands that came with preparation for a career in medicine or dentistry. Bruce had a high hill to climb, and he knew it, but he was optimistic he'd make it, and Arliss would be there to help him. Arliss herself was an everyman's vision of Middle America. She was a studious young woman who also served as an enthusiastic cheerleader at Bismarck High for 3 years. Rounding out her life, she was a devout practicing Christian who swelled with a religious ardor that was almost a quaint artifact of a simpler, more compassionate past in the USA of 1974. A friend to many, and confidant of some, Arliss was a pretty girl, tiny, almost fragile in stature. She had a quick smile, an inquisitive, probing nature that overriding passion for the lections of the Lord. Always in motion, she passed some of her idle hours at Stanford with frequent lawn walks around the campus, sometimes jogging to release her pent-up energy. She had shoulder-length wavy blonde hair, wore glasses and, being fallible, was possessed of an occasional streak of self-righteousness that could grate on the nerves of those less enthralled with the holy word than she was, and more than anything else, religion seemed to dominate Arliss's life. Like her future husband, Arliss belonged to the Fellowship of Christian Athletes in Bismarck. She also joined Young Life, a student evangelical society whose members taught Sunday school, studied the Bible, and strove to spread the message to the masses. Including among those masses was the North Dakota drug culture. And since Arliss didn't employ halfway measures when it came to her faith, she was an outgoing, insistent missionary of God. Maybe it was there, in that consequential corner of her being, that she angered the devil. There had been a boy in her life before Bruce, friends say, but they don't reveal much about him. Only that it was puppy love hearts and flowers, long consigned to a scrapbook by the time she and Bruce fell in love. Their bond was their religion. Slowly at first they were drawn together, and then the romance gathered steam. There was a period of dating and courtship, a year of long-distance engagement while Bruce scrambled through his freshman year at Stanford, and finally a picture-book wedding ceremony held at Bismarck Reformed Church on August 17, 1974. Then, after a week's honeymoon at a rustic cabin owned by Arliss's parents, it was back to business as the new Mr. and Mrs. Bruce Perry drove west and settled into their California home as September began. Several weeks later, on October 1st, one of the couple's major concerns evaporated when Arliss was hired as a receptionist at a Palo Alto law firm, where she listed her part-time experience at the Bismarck dental office of Duncan Perry as a reference. The supplemental income would ease the financial strain, and Arliss also now had a way to fill her delays while Bruce attended classes. In her free time, she continued to explore the expansive campus, also stopping to pray at the large decorative Stanford Memorial Church in the quadrangle Bruce, when his schedule allowed, would accompany her there. Whether or not Arliss was slightly bored is impossible to determine, but she did miss her Bismarck family and friends. She was young, not accustomed to being away from home, and Bruce's responsibilities, which included tutoring freshmen in math, occupied much of his time. In one letter to North Dakota, she lamented, "Friends are hard to find here. Many times I've been tempted to go knock on doors asking if anybody needs a friend, but I guess we just have to appreciate each other and trust the Lord for new friends too." Arliss also discovered pronounced lifestyle differences between the Dakotas and California. "Nobody here is very personal at all," she wrote. "They don't even say hello when you ride up the elevator with them." Arliss was indeed a long way from home. The Dakotas are ruggedly beautiful in their simplicity and remoteness, ironically. While that inaccessibility has helped maintain a low crime rate, it has also contributed to the law-breaking that does exist. Young people everywhere tinker with drugs and liquor, but in North Dakota experimentation sometimes lingers on because the state and others like it are devoid of the diversions available in more populous areas with the major metropolitan centers. In short, some people can become burdened by too many wide open spaces for a long time. On the other hand, the Dakotas have been spared the incredible amount of crimes which bubbles in the big cities, where festering ghettos and teeming industrial districts provide a conducive backdrop for organized mayhem of every variation, major league narcotics dealings, murder, rape, and mugging. The new and rapid-paced world was overwhelming to Arliss, who, like so many before her, suddenly found herself a small fish in a sizable pond. Bruce Perry empathized with his wife's adjustments phase, having endured it himself a year earlier. Sensing her mood that Saturday night, he decided to join her on a walk to the mailbox. At about 11:30 p.m., apparently in good spirits, the young couple strolled from the high-rise campus apartment building. Engrossed in conversation, they assembled across the school grounds and suddenly began to argue. The report's subject was minor, ludicrous in fact, unless other matters were occupying one's mind at the time. A tire on their car was slowly losing air, and each thought the others should have it filled. The bickering continued as they strode in the direction of the memorial church, which loomed before them in the distance. It was about 11:40 p.m. Ostensibly miffed at Bruce, Arliss halted abruptly, faced him, and emphatically stated that she wanted to be alone. She told her husband she intended to visit the church and would see him later at the apartment, which was about half a mile away. Equally annoyed, Bruce turned from his wife and hastened back across the campus. Obvious to the sounds of revelry wafting around him as he walked, he didn't notice whether anyone was watching him. At approximately 11:50 p.m., Arliss Perry pulled open the massive outer doors of Stanford Memorial and entered the foyer, where another set of portals offered access to the main body of the church. Stanford Memorial is an ornate and somewhat imposing. It is a decorous, breathtaking edifice, and as Arliss stepped inside, she saw a veritable rainbow of scarlet and gold. There were rich velvet tapestries of red and purple and montages, sculptures and candelabra. Never heard that word before. Of immaculately polished, glistened gold. Rich people words. Above it all was magnificent golden dome. Above it all was a magnificent golden dome. In front of Arliss, and alleviated several steps from the floor of the church, was the main altar. To either side were round alcoves which contained additional pews, all angled to face the altar. In rough outline form, the building resembled a thick three-leafed clover, with the altar alcove in the center. Excuse me. The church, as always, would be shuttered at midnight by a campus security guard, and since it was nearly 12, only 2 other worshippers sat in a silent vigil of prayer. These young people, who occupied a pew to the right of the center aisles, is the rear of the church, noticed Arliss in the subdued perimeter lighting as she softly padded down the main aisle, eased her way into one of the front rows and left and knelt to pray. For her nocturnal visit, Arliss dispensed with formality. She wore a dark brown jacket, a blouse, blue jeans, and a pair of beige wedged-heeled shoes. Bruce Perry, having returned to Quillen Hall, was still fidgety about the altercation with his wife. He probably gave no thought to the futility of mailing letters late on a Saturday night. Arliss stated no reason for wanting to go out. With no Sunday mail collection at Stanford, the letters wouldn't be processed until Monday morning. It is also unlikely, he considered the possibility, that Arliss might have wished to go out alone and used the letter as an excuse for doing so, and he probably didn't reflect on how their adjustments grew so out of proportion. He probably didn't reflect on how their argument grew so out of proportion, resulting in Arliss's continuing to the church by herself. But there was no reason for Bruce Perry to have been analyzing such thoughts as he passed the apartment and worked out his irritation. Back in the church, as Arliss meditated at midnight, the two worshippers behind her rose to leave. It was now closing time. Looking over their shoulders as they departed, they saw that Arliss hadn't moved from her pew. She was now alone in the cavernous house of worship. Outside, a passerby spotted a young man who was about to enter the building. He was casually dressed and had sandy-colored hair, which was parted on the left. He was a medium build and wore a royal blue short-sleeved shirt. He appeared to be around 23 to 25 years of age. For some reason, the witness noted the man wasn't wearing a watch. Security guard Steve Crawford was a few minutes behind schedule when, at 12:10 a.m., he stood in the rear of the church, looking for stragglers and saw none. There was no sign of Arliss or the sandy-haired stranger. Crawford then spoke aloud into the apparently empty, dimly lit church. "We're closing for the night. The church is being locked for the night now. If anyone is here, you'll have to leave." He answered by his echo rebounding off the muted statues, yes. He was answered by his echo rebounding off the muted statues and shadowed walls and rolling slowly back to him. Satisfied, Crawford shut the doors, locked them, and walked away, leaving Arliss Perry alone with the devil in the house of God. Almost certainly, she was already in Satan's grasp when Crawford voiced his notification. From where she was being hidden, she would have heard him calling out, listened to the great portals clanging shut, and heard her heart pounding in the deathly stillness that followed. But she probably never believed she wouldn't leave the church alive. At about that moment, Bruce Perry was nervous. He disdained arguing over trivia. He was unhappy that his bride was alone somewhere on the campus after midnight, and he didn't take to cooling his heels waiting for her in the apartment. So he hurriedly set off to rendezvous with Arliss. If the church was closed, their paths would cross on the way, but they didn't, and Bruce found himself puzzled and slightly concerned. It was now 12:15 a.m., and he stared at the front of the darkened church. The doors were locked, and where was Arliss? He walked around the side entrance, which was also secured, and then circled to the rear of the building, but she wasn't there either. Bruce then decided to comb the campus and left. At about this time, a passerby thought he discerned some noise inside the church, in the vicinity of the choir loft, but he was uncertain and kept walking. Bruce's tour of the campus was futile. Growing increasingly anxious, he abandoned his search and returned to Quaylen Hall, but Arliss wasn't there. He didn't think his wife had been that upset, and since she didn't know anyone at Stanford yet, she couldn't have just dropped in on some party. No, Bruce reasoned she must be walking it off, calming herself down before coming home, and so Bruce Perry waited and worried. At 2 a.m. on the next series of rounds, security guard Steve Crawford again checked the church. He tried all the doors and assured himself they were locked. He said later that he also walked through the building as he was supposed to, and saw and heard nothing. Across the campus, Bruce Perry was in a quandary. At 3 a.m., he finally had enough and reached for the telephone. He dialed the Stanford Security Police and reported his wife missing, telling the dispatcher Arliss might have fallen asleep in the church and had been locked in at midnight. Responding to the call, Stanford officers went to the church. They would later say they examined the outer doors and found them locked. Unfortunately, that action was irrelevant. The police didn't go inside, which was the only way to learn if someone was indeed asleep in one of the pews. If the only way to learn if someone was indeed asleep in the pews, if they had, and if their statements in Crawford's account are correct, they would have met the killer. This is so because when Crawford next returned to the church at 5:30 a.m., a door on the right side was open, forced from the inside. His discovery suggested that someone broke out of the church after 3 a.m. After the 3 a.m. visit by the Stanford officers, which is possible but unlikely. What is more credible is that Crawford, despite his statement, never entered the building at 2 a.m., and that the Stanford police didn't check all the doors an hour later. The time of Arliss's death would be fixed at approximately midnight, and it is improbable the killer or killers loitered in the church for 3 hours afterwards. But now, at 5:30, alerted by the forced side door, Crawford cautiously entered the chapel. In the faint light, he quickly appraised the main altar to determine if anything valuable had been stolen, but nothing appeared to be disturbed. And so Crawford began a slow, wary walk around the perimeter aisle, peering apprehensively into the pews. It was then he discovered the missing Arliss Perry. He wished he hadn't. In the words of a church official who later viewed the scene, the sight was ritualistic and satanic. And indeed, it was a vision from hell. Arliss was lying on her back, with a body partially under the last pew in the left side alcove, a short distance from where she was last seen praying. Above her was a large carving which had been sculptured into the church wall years before. It was an engraving of a cross. The symbolism was explicit. Arliss's head was facing forward toward the main altar. Her legs were spread wide apart, and she was nude from the waist down. The legs of her blue jeans were spread eagle upside down across her calves, purposely arranged in the manner. Viewed from above, the resulting pattern of Arliss's legs and those of the inverted blue jeans took on a diamond-like shape. Arliss's blouse was torn apart, and her arms were folded across her chest. Placed neatly between her breasts was an altar candle, completing the desecration. Another candle, 30 inches long, was jammed into her vagina. But that wasn't all. She also had been beaten and choked. However, none of that butchery caused her death. Arliss Perry died because an ice pick had been rammed into her skull behind her left ear. Its handle protruded grotesquely from her head. None of this explicit information would reach the public. Crawford, gagging at the horrible sight, fled the empty church and summoned his superiors. They, in turn, immediately called the Santa Clara County Sheriff's Department, which had criminal jurisdiction over the Stanford campus. A team of uninformed officers and 6 detectives sped to the scene. Under Sheriff Tom Rosa, viewing the body, quickly characterized the slaying as the work of a sexual psychopath. As the officials secured the church, other detectives went to the Perry apartment, believing, logically enough, that Bruce was a likely suspect. In fact, he opened the door for the police. He was nearly arrested on the spot, and not without reason. Bruce Perry was covered with blood. The horror-stricken athlete was told of his wife's death and questioned about the events the night before. Through tears and agitation, Bruce tried to convince the detectives that the blood staining his shirt was his own. He explained that he was prone to nosebleeds when upset, and said his anxiety about Arliss set off an attack. He pleaded with the police, who were skeptical, to put it mildly. But a polygraph test and a check of the blood type would soon tell the story. It was indeed his own blood, or at least it wasn't Arliss's. Most of the specific details about the murder were withheld, including the exact location of the stab wound and the fact that the weapon was recovered. Police will routinely conceal some pertinent information as a way to separate truth from fiction, in the event a suspected identification, or as a means of eliminating bedbug confessors. And in this instance, particulars weren't disclosed because of the revolting violation of the victim. It was now a couple of hours past dawn, and the morning was blossoming into a bright and sunny Sunday. The air was clear, the sky was cloudless, but the night had yet relinquished its grip. The damage done by the powers of darkness was still apparent as the word spread across Stanford that something terrible had occurred in the church while the campus slept. In a few hours, the Sunday service was scheduled to begin, but not this Sunday, not inside the church. Police and coroner's investigators sealed it off and poured through it looking for something, anything that could lead them to the killer. The devil had claimed this Lord's Day as his own. 3 members of the choir appeared at 9 a.m. to prepare selections for the 50-member choral group, but they weren't allowed inside to retrieve their music until 10:15, when Arliss's body was finally rolled out on a gurney by downcast coroner's investigators. As worshippers assembled for the 11 a.m. service, they mingled with a burgeoning crowd of media, police, and curious, shocked students. Voices were hushed. Occasionally a police radio crackled. Reverend Robert Hamerton Kelly, dean of the church, had seen Arliss in death and was aghast. Visibly shaken, he was determined to hold the service out of doors in the rear of the church, where he told the congregation about the murder, saying the ceremony wasn't canceled because he wasn't going to let evil triumph. At 4:30 that afternoon, the interior of the non-denominational church was turned back to God as Fathers John Duria and Robert Gaiuri celebrated a Roman Catholic Mass, which began with a blessing scripted to reclaim Stanford Memorial from the forces of evil. The Santa Clara Sheriff's Department was mounting its own campaign against the forces of evil, mainly by failing to see they existed. From the outset, the department's superior officers directed a hunt for a local sexual psychopath. Such preconceptions aren't unique to Santa Clara County, but in the Perry case, they cost the police a realistic chance to locate the killer or killers. The top possible suspects at the beginning, of course, were Bruce Perry and security guard Steve Crawford. Ranked behind them was unknown sexual psychopath, who most probably was the sandy-haired young man seen entering the church at midnight. The man's existence was withheld from the public, along with other details which might have dampened the sex crime theory. The fact that the murder occurred in a church meant little to the police, who didn't believe in symbolism, even when coupled with Arliss's own active religious background. Also kept under wraps was the knowledge that FBI technicians in Washington, D.C. lifted a perfect palm print from the candle found in Arliss's vagina. That discovery finally eliminated Crawford and Bruce Perry as possible suspects, and eventually inspired the police to fingerprint more than 100 other individuals who ranged from students to who ranged from students and university employees to area sex deviants, and yet the biggest clues eluded them. On Tuesday, October 15th, the Stanford Church was the setting for a memorial service for Arliss Perry. Bruce, his skin crawling at the prospect of walking into the scene of his wife's slaying, nonetheless swallowed his repulsion and attended, seated in the front row with his father and uncle, who had flown in from Bismarck. Bruce and some 150 other mourners heard Reverend Hamilton Kelly eulogize Arliss as a member of the body of Christ who was cut off as she prayed. His voice ringing from the pulpit beneath the golden dome, Kelly noted that Christ, too, was cruelly murdered by cruel and perverse men. He was a victim. Arliss in her death was like her Lord. I assure you that Arliss is with Christ in glory. Violence, Kelly intoned, his voice dropping, has swept to the very altar of God. The mourners then joined in several choruses of solemn hymns. Some wept openly, others dabbed their eyes with handkerchiefs, and more were on the verge of tears. Many in the church were classmates and friends of Bruce. Arliss hadn't been on the coast long enough to make many friends or enemies of her own. As the sorrowful throng waited for Bruce, his father and his uncle to file out after service, one of the acquaintances Arliss had managed to make in the 6 weeks of her California life was started. Mark Connors was looking at Bruce, and something was wrong. Bruce Perry wasn't supposed to be here. Mark Connors worked at the Palo Alto law firm of Spaeth, Blaze, Valentine, and Klein, where Arliss was hired as a receptionist just 2 weeks before her death. In the church, Connors strained for a close look at Bruce. He met him outside, expressed his sympathy, and then he knew for sure Bruce Perry was not the man he believed was Bruce Perry. Contacting the sheriff's office with a story that should have turned the investigation around, but didn't, Connors recounted a dramatic event from the afternoon of Friday, October 11th, the day before Arliss died. It was noontime, and Arliss was behind her reception desk when a visitor appeared. Connors assumed it was Bruce Perry since Arliss was so new in California, and newer yet at her job. Who else would know where she worked? Connors watched as Arliss, the young man, engaged in a 15-minute conversation he described as serious and intense. He speculated that Arliss might have been angry at Bruce for coming to the office soon after her hiring. Regardless, he decided Bruce was a nice-looking young man who seemed to be in his early 20s. He was wearing jeans and a plaid shirt, and was a husky, broad-shouldered, and athletic-looking. He stood about 5'10", and had curly blondish hair of regular length. He wasn't a hippie freak. And here's a footnote down here. Every person named in this writing is real. Only the names of certain confidential witnesses and living suspects have been changed, and those will be noted by an asterisk. As the earnest discussion ended, Connors was surprised that Arliss didn't introduce him to Bruce. But if the topic of their talk was as important as it appeared to be, then perhaps Arliss reasoned this wasn't the time or place for social amenities, Connor thought. When the young man left, Arliss resumed her duties. She said nothing to Connors or anyone else about the visitor, leaving him with the impression that the young bride's husband dropped by unannounced to settle a pressing matter. Until the memorial service, Connors believed he had seen Bruce Perry, but now he stated that it certainly had been him after all. The detectives took down the information and asked Bruce if he'd stopped at the law firm. He hadn't, and Bruce further advised the investigators that Arliss asked him not to call or visit there until she settled into the job. Did she mention a visitor the day before she died? The police inquired. She hadn't, Bruce replied, adding that it wouldn't be unusual for Arliss to keep something from him if she thought the knowledge would be upsetting to him. Arliss's friend in North Dakota would later make that same observation 5 years later. When the detectives continued, not this man's when the detectives continued, does this man sound like anyone you'd know? Bruce Perry shook his head. No, it didn't. The police knew what Bruce was unaware of, but they disregarded the fact in their single-minded quest for a random sex pervert. The description of Arliss's visitor was similar to that of the man seen entering the church the next night. Surprisingly, they didn't assign a police artist to draw sketches of the two men for comparison or identification purposes. And the questions that should have been asked were unspoken. Who was the main law office? Who knew Arliss in California? Who knew where she worked? Could the killer have come from Bismarck? Is it possible the slaying wasn't the work of an area psycho after all? Could Arliss have actually known her killer? It is possible this guy was from Bismarck, didn't know Bruce, but learned where Arliss was from and others in North Dakota. Could he have known her family or Bruce's, who were among the few who did know that Arliss had recently found employment? Or could he have just known she was at Stanford, followed her around until he learned where she worked, and then dropped in on her? And why did he materialize only a day before her death? Could Arliss have known Bruce would have disappeared? Could Arliss have known Bruce would have disapproved of whoever was and consequently arranged to meet him secretly at the church and fabricated the letter mailing an argument to get Bruce out of the way? Or did she tell this guy to split when he came to the office, but followed her the next day, saw the altercation with Bruce, and seized the chance to kill her? If so, why? There was no question that he had murder on his mind. The killer carried the ice pick into church. It wasn't a weapon of opportunity. So was this a premeditated slaying and not a random sex crime at all? But the questions weren't asked, or at least weren't pursued. As the police hunted their Jack the Ripper in California, Arliss Perry returned to North Dakota. She left Bismarck in Bruce's automobile. She came home in a box. The Bismarck Reformed Church, where the couple had been joyously married 2 months before, was the site of the funeral on Friday, October 18th. As the bells pleaded mournfully, about 300 friends, relatives, former schoolmates, and hangers-on filed into the church. Virtually everyone who had attended the wedding to wish Arliss a long and happy life gathered again to see her grave. There is a chance someone involved in the murder was among them. It was a crushing experience for those close to Arliss. The wedding day was still fresh in their minds, too recent to have yet become a memory. Most hadn't seen the bridal pictures yet. Arliss's parents, her sister Karen, a brother Larry, reacted to the death
with total shock and disbelief. Bruce Perry found himself at the second service for his wife in 3 days. He lived the equivalent of a lifetime in 8 weeks. As he listened to the eulogy with his head lowered heavily into his chest, Bruce heard Arliss described as a deeply committed Christian who lived a life dedicated to God and her fellow man. Her own words, now so distant and of yesterday, were spoken aloud by Reverend Don DeCock, who read from verses Arliss had underlined in her Bible, and from marginal notes such as "very nice" she'd written beside him. DeCock talked of Arliss. Her friend Jenny closed her eyes and envisioned a golden day and an unseen California hill and meadow from where Arliss had penned a letter on October 6th, the Sunday before she died. "We're on a picnic right now. It's about 90 degrees and we're suntanning in the hills. Bruce is studying and I'm writing letters." Then, in a poignant irony, Arliss explained, "We went to the Stanford church this morning. Maybe you remember me telling you about it. The guest speaker was Malcolm Boyd. Maybe you've heard of him. He's the author of Are You Running With Me, Jesus? I've never read the book, but I'm going to be sure now." "No, Arliss," the crestfallen Jenny thought, "you never got the chance." In the pulpit, DeCock recalled a time when Arliss enunciated what Christ meant to her. She once thought of God as a judge seated behind a huge bench who pointed a finger down at her when she was doing wrong. The pastor remembered quoting Arliss as not believing she could be significant to such a big God. "But when I realized he really does care for me," she said, "it was like a choir of angels bursting into song." Throughout Bismarck, the reality-setting grief succumbed to fury as people asked why. Murder was an intrusion in Bismarck, an aberration. Murder belonged in the big cities, not in their territory. More people were killed in New York City in a week than in Bismarck in a year, they said, and they were right, and the bitterness intensified. Inevitably, California was raked over for sprawling the slime that would brutally murder a young girl, and in a church besides, a double desecration. Indeed it was, but as righteously as California could be indicted for a century of sins, there were those hints, those indications that perhaps this time wasn't one of them. The families didn't know that, neither did the press or the public. The Santa Clara detectives knew, but seeing they were blind. They were running their own game, working their own leads, convinced the killer was from the neighboring area. But the signs were there. They weren't totally in focus. But the faint lettering which appeared to read Bismarck first, of course, was the puzzling incident of Arliss's visitor, who entered her California life just 36 hours before it ended. The police considered that he might merely have been a delivery man or a prospective client of the law firm, but that couldn't hold up for various reasons. But most important, the intense 15-minute discussion demonstrated that Arliss either knew the young man or else he was bearing a message from someone she didn't know. Where did the people whom Arliss knew live? They resided in North Dakota, not on the West Coast, and if there in fact was a motive for the killing, it would be hidden in Bismarck, not Palo Alto, but the sheriff's investigators didn't make the connection. They still didn't budge 2 weeks later around Halloween when another bizarre incident occurred, which should have sent red flags flying, and it even happened in Bismarck, at Arliss's grave. At the time of her burial, a temporary marker was placed on the site until a permanent stone could be readied. It was stolen Random vandalism was ruled out as no other markers were disturbed, only Arliss's. A sick souvenir? It certainly was. Santa Clara detectives already knew of two other souvenirs involved in the case, personal possessions of Arliss which were removed from the murder scene by the killers, trophies, reminders, proof that the job was done by whoever was supposed to do it. The public didn't know this, just as it wasn't aware of the visitor to the law firm or the man at church, but the police did know, and yet they reacted stoically to the news of the theft in Bismarck. That wasn't the only time information was backburned. There was still another incident, just as ominous, which was half-heartedly pursued and dropped. The details were provided by Bruce Perry's parents. They'd heard a story, a tale which unsettled them, and they wondered if it was possibly connected to the murder. According to the word on the streets in Bismarck, Arliss and a girlfriend whose name the Perrys didn't know had crossed the river from Bismarck to neighboring Mandan one day to try to convert members of some satanic cult to Christianity. That sounded like Arliss. The unknown girlfriend, the Perrys believed, was probably a member of Young Life, the student religious organization. The indictment was said to have occurred during the year Bruce was at Stanford and Arliss in Bismarck. Yes, the Perrys agreed. It might only be a rumor, but in light of Arliss's death in a church and the theft of the graveyard marker in Bismarck, they felt the California police should be aware of it. The Santa Clara detectives were 1,700 miles away from Bismarck, and they lacked the manpower or budget to conduct an intensive investigation into North Dakota, and they still believed the killer was a local sex marauder. With some degree of routine assistance from Bismarck authorities, they made a cursory check to try to solidify information. A number of Young Life officials were questioned about the incident. Interestingly, people had heard of it, but no one seemed to know exactly when it happened or the name of the girl who allegedly accompanied Arliss that day. And so it died. And another detail which could have proved vital to the investigation would also lay dormant for years. Time crept by, and except for periodic anniversary stories, Arliss's name was disappeared from California news columns. In the sheriff's department, her file gradually drifted to an open but inactive drawer. Detective Sergeant Ken Kahn and his partner Tom Beck, who weren't assigned to the case at its outset, were now appointed to monitor the search and pursue new leads if and when they surfaced. About every 6 months, Arliss's parents would phone the sheriff's office to learn if any progress had been made. Bruce Perry, who eventually graduated from Stanford and became a doctor, would do the same, but the answer from Kahn and Beck was always no. There was nothing to report then. It was still several years before the chilling handwritten clue, Arliss Perry hunted, stalked, and slain, followed to California, would be scrawled across a page in a book about Satanism and secreted from the confines of a forbidding New York prison. But those haunting days were yet to dawn, and as the summer of 1977, the murder of the young Christian bride remained unsolved. That's it for Chapter 1.